Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 214 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danielle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. So I'm calling this episode, How Often Do You Think About the Crusades? Because apparently there is a trend going around on TikTok where women are asking the men in their lives, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And they're being surprised by how often these men are thinking about the Roman Empire. And it's bringing up all sorts of questions about history and the way we construct our narratives about things like Rome. And it's bringing up things like we think about the Roman Empire in certain ways that emphasize masculinity and violence and great man narratives. And why do we think about Rome in these ways? And I think that this is relevant to the study of the Middle Ages because there are a lot of hot buttons when it comes to the Middle Ages where people also have these simplistic narratives that sometimes can be a bit troubling. For those of you who are not Canadian, we have Canadian Thanksgiving coming up this weekend. So there are going to be a lot of people who are maybe talking about the Roman Empire around the dinner table, and definitely a lot of people talking about the Roman Empire on social media. So today I thought I would give you my 2 cents on how to have these discussions about history with people who have some knowledge and they're a little bit dug in to ideas that maybe are not actually correct about history. How do we talk about history with people who don't know as much as we do about it? How do we have these difficult conversations about it? So you're going to get my 2 cents on that if you choose to stick around for it right after this. So all of us here at the Medieval Podcast, you, me, everyone who is listening, all of us are fans of learning history, not necessarily fans of history. And what I mean by that is that we're not necessarily fans of the way some people in history have acted, but we are here because we like learning about history. And if you're here on the Medieval Podcast anyway, you're someone who likes to have old ideas challenged, I think, because that's what I do every week is bring on experts who will challenge our old ideas about the Middle Ages. So chances are you're a person who likes having your ideas about the past challenged, but not everyone is like that. So how do we have a discussion about history? Or in other words, a lot of people think about history in troubling ways. What do we do about it as people who love learning about history? So I chose the Crusades as the case for this episode because Crusades are tied up in masculinity and violence and West versus East thinking in a lot of the same ways that when people talk about the Roman Empire, that's what they're thinking of. So I think it's a good comparable case study when it comes to the Middle Ages. So when people talk about the Crusades, often they're talking in a simplistic narrative, right? This idea of these two clashes of religions and quote unquote civilizations, as if there isn't a whole complex tapestry of things going on there. We know from our own experience that people's motivations to do things like go on crusade vary from person to person and actually from moment to moment. So why do people have these simplistic ideas about the Crusades? Well, one, it's easy and it's simple, and people's brains, human brains, love a shortcut. We love to think about things in simple stories. So there's that. It's easy to hold on to. And number 2 is we've always been taught this way, in part because teachers will give you a simple narrative so that you can hold on to it and understand, and people can build on that. But also, we've always been taught this way because of traditional ways of thinking and traditional power structures. So there's a lot of us today that are looking at our power structures and looking at old ideas and thinking about how to change them. But we need to remember that the way people have always talked about history has been informed by those things. So it's not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of old traditional ideas. And that is something that keeps getting perpetuated. So for example, if we just think about the progress that women have made in the last century, right? If we look at where women were around the turn of 1900 versus today, there's a lot of change that had to happen for us to get there. So change is slow, and the way that we talk about things is based on old and traditional structures. So I've said I'm going to give you my 2 cents on how to talk about history with people who know some things but not a lot of things, or they think about history in a way that perhaps we find troubling. How do I do it? Well, I'm going to give you my secrets. And you're probably, if you're somebody who's been exposed to my work more than once, you're probably going to see this in the way that I talk to people about history and the way I present the podcast. It's my way of doing it. I'm not going to say it's the only way, but this is how I approach talking to people about history. And the first thing we need to recognize, I have 4 points. The first one is that history is emotional. People are emotional. And any psychologist will tell you that the decisions that we make that we think are rational are actually emotional. And this means anything from buying a car, which you think you're doing in a very sophisticated and objective way, to talking about historical people. You're here probably because you are invested in history. It makes you feel something. And for those people on the other side of your discussion, they are emotional about it too. So it's important to recognize this at the beginning. We are emotional when we're discussing it, and the people we're discussing it with are also emotional about it, whether we recognize this consciously or not. But I'm suggesting we do recognize it consciously, at least when it comes to us and the way we approach people, because we're going to recognize that there are hot buttons, that we're getting a little hot under the collar about it. And the more we recognize, hey, I'm emotional about this, the easier it's going to be to step back a little bit and remove yourself from the emotion of the moment and have a discussion with the person in front of you instead of all of those churning emotions that you have inside yourself. So take a deep breath when you're having a discussion about history and recognize that your emotions are going to get stirred up. It's just how it is. And if you love history, that's awesome. It's one of the reasons we come to it is because of emotions. But when we're talking with other people, we need to recognize that we have a lot of feels going on. So regulate yourself accordingly, whether this means taking deep breaths or perhaps pushing that glass of wine a little further from your plate, at least while you're having this discussion about history. So one of the reasons that it's so emotional talking about history is because it's often tied to identity, right? So when people are talking about history, they're often talking about people who they think of as their ancestors, whether culturally or actually genetically. People are tied to identity when they're talking about history. So if you have someone that's super invested in Crusade narratives, really, or any narratives, they might be identifying with some of the people involved in this history in some way. I don't recommend that you call people out on that, right? I don't recommend that you say you're interested in crusading history because you think you're a Templar. Like, that is not going to de-escalate the situation if it's getting hot. But recognize and try to find the way that maybe they are identifying with this history in some way so that you can see it and try to avoid attacking that part of their identity. Because when people feel as if their identity is being attacked, that's when things will get out of control. And that's not what we want. But thinking about how this might actually be part of someone's identity, it'll explain perhaps why they're so dug into a perspective if they are not shifting on something. It could be the reason why. And I would invite you to also look at why you are so invested in this. Why are you dug into this? Does this have something to do with your identity? If so, recognize that this might be one of the reasons why you're getting worked up about it, perhaps. I think that studying history is a lot about self-reflection, especially if we're trying to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. There's a lot of self-reflection involved in the study of history, at least in my humble opinion. So the next thing is to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. So as medievalists, we all have certain triggers, whether that's bathing or the flat earth thing or, the violence of Vikings or something like that. But it doesn't matter how long we've studied history. It only matters how much they know. We can't just tell people that they're ignorant or they should shape up or they should already know these things because they don't. They're coming to us from a certain place that is probably misinformation. And we just have to recognize that's where they're coming from. So stifle those eye rolls because you don't want people to get defensive or you're not going to be able to change their ideas about history. There is absolutely no sense in judging people for not knowing something because we all started somewhere and chances are we started in the same place with the same narratives. For example, many of us, as I said in my TED Talk, many of us were taught, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And there's all sorts of thinking about Columbus and flat earth and stuff that we're taught in school. Where did you learn it? What did you learn in school? Hopefully you had a great medievalist as a teacher, but probably you didn't, which means that if we're all starting from kind of the same place, we can cast our minds back to where our journey started learning history, and we can empathize with the person in front of us and say, I used to think that too, and here's what I learned about it. It's very hard to get someone to shift their thinking if they feel defensive. I'm going to say this a lot of times in this episode, but it's very hard to get people to shift their thinking, even about something as benign or unimportant as whether Romans bathed a lot or medieval people bathed a lot. Like in our daily lives, that's not super important. But when people feel defensive, they will really get upset about it. And you don't want to get people defensive if you want to change their minds about something. So no one wants to hear, well, actually. But if you come at it from, I used to think that too, and here's what I have learned, or I just found out that that's a myth. Can you believe it? Like, I can't believe it. This is something that I learned in school, but we all learned in school. But it turns out that it's not true. I listened to a really awesome podcast about it. Hint, hint. I listened to a really awesome podcast about it, and I learned a lot of things from an expert on this subject. Dropping a podcast, I mean, it's great for me if I get more people who are coming to the Medieval podcast. That's awesome. But dropping a podcast is a really good way of starting to change people's minds, because nobody is going to go directly to a university library and start researching something. They're just not. But they might come to a podcast when they're commuting or something like that. And that might be the easiest way, the best way, the gentlest way to start learning more about history. And chances are that's one of the ways which you learn more about history. One of the ways which I learned more about history was through a gentle means, usually from a public historian who is excited about it. So a podcast is a good recommendation. If you choose to recommend the Medieval podcast, I'm always grateful. But a nice and easy introduction to a subject is the best way to get people to start changing their thinking about it. My third point is one I've hinted at a fair amount, and that is to be empathetic. And this is something that I think we need to consciously remind ourselves to do when we're in a discussion with someone that we know very well. We might assume that we know everything about them already. Maybe we do, but chances are we don't. So think about it as the way that you think about history yourself. We spend a lot of time here at the podcast and probably on your own when you're thinking about history, looking to the past to understand those people. What were their motivations? Why did they make the decisions that they made? What is the underlying thought behind it? Who are they crushing on, for example? There's a lot of people who spend a lot of time thinking about who has romantic involvements with other people, for example, because we know that small things influence human behavior. So what I'm asking you to do, what I suggest doing when you're talking about history with other people, is to take that training and extend it to the person in front of you. So when you're thinking about history, you're thinking about Anne Boleyn or something. It just popped into my head because so many people think about Anne Boleyn. So say you're thinking about Anne Boleyn and you're thinking about why she made a certain decision on a certain day. Extend that thinking to the person across from you. Why are they thinking in the way they're thinking? Where does their perspective come from? Why have they dug in so hard? Is it about identity? Do they need to be right, or do they want to learn? Because if they just want to be right instead of learning, that is going to influence what you can discuss with that person and how much you can discuss with that person. Are they hungry? Are they stressed? Do they need another helping of turkey? Do they need some sleep? All of this influences how people discuss history and how far you can get in starting to change their thinking about it. Extend that empathy to that other person. And also think about yourself, right? When I think about history, I put myself in other people's shoes because I'm trying to learn and discover more about them. So think about yourself too. Are you hungry? Are you stressed? Do you have a reason why you dug in so hard? Is it identity? Is it just the fact that you have a history with the person in front of you and that is influencing how you're speaking to them? Really take a minute to extend that empathy to that person and some self-compassion to yourself as well, so that you can understand where you're coming from and why you might be coming at this discussion from a certain perspective. So I mentioned people who need to be right. And I think this is another part that is really important when we're talking about changing people's minds in terms of history. So I will tell you, as a woman who studies history, I get a lot of people who are talking to me about it in a way in which they need to be right. And yes, this is usually men, but it could be anybody. People talking about history often need to feel as if they're right about something. And this is not a judgment. Humans like to be right about stuff. I like to be right about stuff. So we can talk about it in a way that helps people be right and that allows us to move even further. So when I'm in a discussion, perhaps with a dude who is talking to me about history, I look for ways in which we can both be right, because that'll automatically make them more receptive to hearing more things from me. And again, this is not a judgment. This is just human nature. We like to be right, and we like to learn from a place where we are feeling secure and we're feeling strong. It's just how we are as people, and that's fine. So say I'm discussing history with someone and we're talking about the Crusades, and they're like, everyone in the Crusades was involved with it because they were super hard into religion. Well, we know that there's a whole bunch of reasons why people were involved in the Crusades, and religion is just one of those things. So I will come at these people and say something like, you're definitely right that a lot of people were involved in the Crusades because of religious reasons. There were a lot of people who were really invested in religion, and that got them there. But did you know that there are a lot of people who were invested in the trade? I didn't realize that the Muslims and the Christians made deals together, because it seems like this isn't something that they would do if they were just dug into religion. So I think that's fascinating. And I might just leave it there. In fact, I often will leave it there and see where the conversation is going from there, because I've shown that I have a broader perspective on this. There is more to say about the Crusades than just the simplistic narrative. And if the person wants to pick it up from there, great. It'll give me an indication of where I can go with it. But just the simple thing of connecting with someone where they are, being empathetic to the fact that they don't want to look stupid in front of you, and finding a place where you can both be right is a great way to start that discussion. Recognizing the humanness of your discussion is a great way to continue to share what you know about a difficult topic, the Crusades, the Roman Empire, without making them dig in. Just recognizing that human nature, that need to be secure or to not lose face in front of someone who they respect. In fact, the person who's having dinner with you probably respects you a lot and doesn't want to look stupid in front of you. So having that empathy and really putting yourself in their shoes and recognizing they want to look good in front of you will allow you to find ways to discuss history that keeps their ego intact, because it's a lot easier to change people's minds if they're not feeling defensive. I told you I was going to say that a lot, and here we go. It's a lot easier to change people's minds if they're not feeling defensive. Which brings me to my last point, and that is take it slowly. Speaking of the Roman Empire, Rome wasn't built in a day, and change is going to take a long time. Sorry if my voice is starting to go, by the way. I've been working really hard on this audiobook for you, Chivalry and Courtesy, and so my voice has taken a beating, so just forgive me if it's a little bit rough today. So Rome wasn't built in a day, and the change that we need to make around history, around the narratives that we have around it in order to make people recognize their complexity and the beauty of them as being not simplistic, is long-term work. And it's work involving the efforts of scholars in the archives, scholars in the classroom, public historians, traditional media too, as well as the everyday heroes at the Thanksgiving table, or the everyday heroes who are gently making corrections on social media. All of this is a team effort, and it's going to take time. So I mentioned how far we've come as women in 100 years. It's going to take time for people's hearts and minds to change. There is a time and a place to take a hard line if somebody is being just cruel and obnoxious and trying to put other people down in a way. You'll recognize when you need to step in and take a hard line. You'll know that moment when it comes. But usually, people do want to learn. They do want to be right. They do want to understand and have a deeper understanding of a topic. So there is a time and place to take a hard line. It's not usually every day, and it's not usually with the friend that you have across the dinner table or in the coffee shop with you. I like to think about change as being like water. So water can make a lot of big changes really fast, but a lot of the permanent changes that it makes are happening over time, very slowly, and in ways that you almost can't recognize. And that is a good way to change human nature as well. So don't try and change someone's mind about something like the Crusades, an idea that they've had for many years, probably. Don't try and change it all at once. It's probably going to backfire. It's probably going to make them go and find stuff on the internet that shows that they are right, that confirms their bias. So confirmation bias is another human thing that we do. We want to be right, so we find the sources that make us right. So the harder you push somebody who's dug in, the less successful you're going to be. This is a slow process. The thing that you want to do is to put them on the path to learning more, and to do that in a way that almost makes it seem like it's their idea. This is one of the best ways to help people learn, is to just leave something there for them to pick up and to follow that thread and to get to know more in their own time and with probably a little bit of privacy, so that they can start to change their minds, start to develop their thinking in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're backed into a corner. Again, this is something I keep saying, but it's true when it comes to human nature. We need to recognize that change is going to be slow. It's not going to happen all at once. Even if we know that we are right about something, their change is not going to happen very quickly, especially about something like the Roman Empire or the Crusades, where it's very easy to find stuff that confirms your bias about it, confirms that it's all this masculine, violent history. It's easy to find that stuff. So we don't want to back someone into a corner where that's all they find. So again, this is just the way I come at history, but I believe we should take it slowly. We should take it gently. We should recognize the other person's humanity and what's important to them, the fact that they want to save face in front of us. We should recognize that, and we should gently push them in the direction, like a helium balloon, in the direction of other sources so they can learn. Because if somebody is sitting across from you at the table or across from you online and they're talking about history, it means they're interested. It means they want to learn. So we just have to gently push them in the direction of reliable sources that will expand their minds. And I mean, this is my whole life. This is my whole work life. It is something I love to do. And I know that you're here because you also love history. So in case you've always wondered, how do I have these discussions with somebody about something that really makes me crazy, whether it's the Roman Empire or bathing or Vikings or whatever? This is the way that I do it. This is the way that I gently make change, or I try to make change over the long term, because I know it's not going to happen overnight as much as I want it to. I think the bottom line is there are some people who are going to be aggressive, who are going to be obnoxious, who are going to push forward ideas of history that are outdated and wrong and are harmful. And we know who those people are. We can recognize them. They are the trolls online. They are the people at the dinner table that maybe you didn't invite, but someone else did. Those people, you need to decide whether you can take them on head to head or whether it's better to just ignore them. And you can decide on a case by case basis what it's worth talking to them about. There are some people who we know are just obnoxious, who are not going to make any change. But there are a lot of people out there who have the wrong impression of history because that's the way they were taught. And it's those people that I think we can gently influence to change their thinking, to make it more complex, to make it more nuanced, and to open up their thinking to allow for more diverse perspectives, to allow for more people to be involved in history, and to allow for more people's stories to be told from history. So it's those people I'm talking about today, those people who I think we can change and whose perspectives we can shift in order to make history a more inclusive place for everyone. Those are my 2 cents. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, this week we take a look at who's who in a medieval manor. So if you're a noble, what were the people who worked for you? What did they do? So we're talking about like a steward, a chamberlain, the laundress, all that kind of staff, your staff.
Perfect. I think I can guess what a laundress is doing. But the other ones, It's good to have a list of all the people who you'd find on a manor, for sure, especially for the people who are creating fiction. This is a good list to have.
Indeed. And so we're using as a template the household of Alice de Brienne. So she's this noblewoman, daughter of a knight, basically took care of her manor and her estate for about like 50 years. And there's this one set of records for an entire year that talks about like everything that's going on. She had a lot of things. They served 16,000 and a half meals that year.
That's a scary amount of meals.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we do eat a lot as people.
Yeah. So that's a kind of a fun piece we've got going. So we also have news on 61 medieval manuscripts that have been digitized and are now available through eCodices, the virtual manuscript library of Switzerland.
Awesome. So these are digitized as in people can zoom in and check out the parchment?
Yeah, exactly. And eCodices is one of the bigger databases of medieval manuscripts. I think a lot of people might be familiar with, hey, the British Library has it, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, but this is a really great one. Like you can really zoom in on these images, and they're up to about 2,500 manuscripts online. So it's a really good resource for medievalists.
That's perfect. And even for people who are not professional medievalists, it's always really interesting to go and zoom in on a manuscript. You can see the hair follicles, you can see the flakes of gold. It's really cool. So everyone should check out eCodices.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, it's just a beautiful imagery too.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
A big shout out to everyone who supports my podcast, as well as other indie podcasts and historians through Medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons can access all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of Medievalist.net and this podcast. You can even get a digital copy of my first book, The 5-Minute Medievalist, right on Patreon. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from discussions to concussions, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danielle Sobalski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can pre-order my new book, Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, which comes out this month. If you've already pre-ordered, thank you, and watch your mailbox because some copies have already started winging their way across the world. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.